Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us uh, bright and early in California mornings, and then good afternoon to everyone else. My name is Kristen Mcguire. I am the Executive Director at Young Invincibles, a national policy and advocacy organization for young adults. I just want to welcome you all to the state of student debt in America. And I'm joined today by some really awesome panelists. I have Cody Hanounian, who is the Executive Director of Student Debt Crisis. We've worked together a really long time, and I'm really happy to be able to moderate the panel with him today. We have Jalil Mustafa Bishop, who's the Assistant Professor of Education at Villanova University. We have a good friend of mine, Mike Pierce, who is the Executive Director of the Student Borrower Protection Center. And we have Abby Shafroth, an attorney with the Student Borrower Assistant Project of the National Consumer Law Center. Cody, if you would like to kick it off really quickly and give yourself more of an in-depth introduction, and then we'll just go from there.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kristen. And it is true, we have worked together. I think everyone on this panel has worked with Student Debt Crisis Center at some point. So I'm really happy to be here with trusted allies and voices in this space. So yes, my name is Cody Hunanian. I'm the Executive Director of the Student Debt Crisis Center. We have about 2 million supporters across the country. Many of them are student loan borrowers. Some of them are parents, allies. I myself am a student loan borrower as well. So I hope to bring to this discussion not only a conversation about what advocates are doing, but also bring you a perspective as a student loan borrower myself. I see folks in the chat are sharing their stories, and I'm certainly happy to share mine as well.
Thank you. Jalil, would you like to give an introduction?
Yes, thank you for the invite, and very excited to be in conversation with other panelists. Again, my name is Dr. Jalil Mustafa Bishop. I'm an assistant professor at Villanova University in the education department. And I've really come to the research and the work and the advocacy around student debt as someone who borrowed student loans when they enrolled in higher education, who has parents who are in their 60s still trying to handle their student loan debt, who has a sibling who has some issues around just their ability to have understood what type of loans they were borrowing based on their institution, and how they're living with kind of a really predatory practice of where they borrowed debt for an institution that didn't make it clear on the upfront what those loans were for. And really coming from a family and a community of Black borrowers where we are trying to navigate not only pre-existing and ongoing systems of inequality, but now the student loan debt that's not giving a promised return. In addition, I'm also a lead researcher of the National Black Student Debt Study, and just excited to be here today to be in conversation with you all.
Thank you so much. And let me make sure I put some respect on your name, Dr. Bishop. Mike, would you like to go next?
Sure, that's a tough act to follow, though. I'm Mike Pierce. I'm the executive director at the Student Borrower Protection Center. We are a policy advocacy nonprofit that's focused on ending the student debt crisis, and we do work across the country. I've had the chance to work with everybody else in this call on litigation, on policy advocacy, on research, and really, it's great to just be able to be here to talk about how student debt's affecting people's lives. And in particular, I think we always look for the opportunity to talk about how big, powerful corporate interests are behind the student debt crisis, and how these big predatory companies are driving people in debt, keeping them in debt, and that you can't really address the student debt crisis without getting justice for people that are wronged by the people driving the student loan system.
And finally, Abby, would you like to tell us a little more about yourself?
Sure, thank you. I'm happy to be here. My name is Abby Shafroth. I'm currently the director of the Student Loan Borrower Assistance Project at the National Consumer Law Center. And our project work does research, policy development, advocacy on trying to find ways to make the student loan system work for all borrowers. Obviously, we have our work cut out for us because the system is very, very far from working for all borrowers now. And particularly, we focus on improvements to the system that will serve the interests of low income and low wealth borrowers and borrowers of color who are the most overburdened by the current system, and who pay the most for this sort of for making a shot at living the American dream. So obviously we have a whole lot of work to do, and we are grateful to be able to collaborate with many of the other folks participating in this panel today, and looking forward to talking together about more ways that we can try to get this done.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Just a little housekeeping. We are going to reserve audience questions for the last 10 to 15 minutes of our panel because we have a lot to talk about in a little bit of time. With that being said, I think I forgot to mention, I am also a student borrower, and so I am also uniquely invested in the work that we do, the same as you all. And Mike, you struck a chord with me with the predatory lending practices. So I'm really looking forward to the conversation we're going to have. So let's jump right in. I think we'll kick this off. A question for Mike, and then anyone else who wants to jump in, please feel free. The title of our panel is The State of Student Debt in America, which is a mouthful already. So can we just get an overview? What is the state of student debt in America right now? Is it going to be canceled? How can we help make this happen? Like, what is going on?
So we got here through a series of big systemic failures that drove tens of millions of people deeply into debt that is unprecedented. More than 45 million people owe $1.7 trillion in student debt. That's more student debt than all of the credit cards in America combined. It's more student debt than all of the car loans in America combined. And things are going badly. We've been, fortunately, student loan borrowers have had their student loan payments paused, the vast majority of them, more than 30 million people, since the start of the pandemic. And that's been a real lifeline to people. But it's not the same thing as having those debts canceled. And for millions of student loan borrowers, chickens are about to come home to roost unless there's some big policy changes that haven't been announced yet. The pause on student loan payments is expected to end at the end of January. And those bills are going to come due unless Joe Biden delivers on his promise to cancel student debt for everybody. And right now, the education department has done some good things, and we'll talk about them in this panel. I'm excited to get into the weeds, but it's not enough. And right now, millions of people are set up to fail. So I hate to open this up with doom and gloom, but the hour is late and the situation is dire. And so here we are.
Cody, you have anything to add here?
Yeah, I was actually going to add, I second everything that Mike says. As an organization that calls student debt a crisis, we certainly believe this is a huge problem, both for individuals and for the economy more broadly. But with that in mind, because we are Student Debt Crisis Center, it's not often that I have many positive things to say, but I do want to underline that, the state of student debt in America is also in a good place. We've seen this movement grow and strengthen over the last year, and the efforts from individuals to pass bold reforms have reached unprecedented levels. And I know, there's a lot of people listening right now that are part of the millions of people that have taken action to cancel student loan debt broadly. We're not there yet, and the president has not delivered that, but we have made significant wins even recently. I was honored to work with Mike Pierce and many of the folks on during today's summit on sharing the stories of teachers and nurses and other public service workers across the country. I think over 40,000 stories were shared with the Department of Education. And what came out of that is over 500,000 borrowers are now going to see easier access to student loan forgiveness. So the movement for broad debt cancellation, bigger, stronger, and more effective than ever. And all of the efforts to address what I consider the common sense fixes are happening, and we're having victories along the way. So that's my positive take, but I also agree with Mike. This is a crisis, and the situation is quite dire.
Abby, Dr. Bishop, anything to add here?
Yeah, if I could jump in just briefly. I totally appreciate Cody's optimism and all the important work that everyone has been doing to work with the administration and get them on track to making some of these existing student loan cancellation programs work more like they were designed to, work more like they are supposed to. However, the amount of student debt that we've seen canceled this year is less than 1% of the outstanding balance. So I just want us to all keep that in mind, that there is a lot of work to do, and that these forgiveness programs, as important as they are always going to fail to reach all of the borrowers who need, deserve, would benefit from relief. For every one borrower who's received student loan forgiveness this year, there are 99 more out there who could also benefit from that, and who are also paying far too much for their education. So we are doing important work, we're making progress, and we have a lot more ahead of us.
I'll just add 2 points. I think to echo the sentiments that we are having real wins. I think the cancellation, abolish student debt movement is growing and getting stronger and more nuanced, and coming from different angles that we have. People who are coming from labor unions, people who are coming from the research side, the activist, more movement builder side, and coming together and really calling out and naming the dynamic crisis that is student debt and how it's impacting people across race, class, and gender, and impacting people also across life points. That sometimes we like to think of this as early graduates out of higher ed, and I think we have done a lot of work in the movement to show how nuanced and how widespread the issues are. And then I would also echo Abby's point around the Department of Ed, that a lot of the reforms and real wins we have seen should be, in my opinion, kind of categorized as the Department of Ed kind of making up for things that they should have done a long time ago, and finally enforcing policies that have been on the books and just simply haven't been enforced, finally running programs as they were presented to borrowers, as borrowers understood them, as borrowers agreed to them, and finally really following through. So a lot of what we're seeing is the Department of Ed playing catch up, and I think the next step for us is to make sure that they still do the larger demands around what borrowers need, such as broad-based cancellation.
So Abby, you mentioned about how how it impacted certain people, which kind of takes me to my next question. We already know that the student debt crisis isn't evenly carried amongst all borrowers, and that there's also a racial justice implication as well. Can we talk a little bit about how some of these lesser known or lesser discussed issues drive the student debt crisis? And why it's important that we discuss these things and how they're critical to creating policy change. And I think we can start with Abby and then go on over to Dr. Bishop, and then from there.
Sure, yeah. So there are a lot of ways that the student loan system systematically overburdens the people that we think of the student loan system as being designed to support and give opportunities to. We think of the student loan system as created so that people who don't have the wealth available to them to just immediately pay for college can get access to a college education in America, can achieve economic security and ideally economic mobility. But unfortunately, for too many low-income borrowers, too many borrowers who don't benefit from intergenerational wealth, and too many borrowers of color, student loans are instead holding them back. They're preventing borrowers from achieving sort of a positive net worth, from getting ahead, and are really a drain on the borrowers, on their families, on their communities. So we know that, for example, Black borrowers have to borrow more than other students for the same degrees. And that Black borrowers 20 years, I believe, after leaving school owe almost the full amount that they graduated with, 95% of their debt still at that point, as opposed to the median white borrower who's paid off 94% of their debt at that point. And this is because of, a number of systemic issues with intergenerational wealth being one of the most important components of it. And I think that the intergenerational wealth aspect of student loans is something that has been ignored for too long, and that I'm grateful that people are really focusing more attention on these days. There are lots of discussions about sort of is student debt cancellation regressive? and one of the most obvious responses to that is no. It is the people who lack wealth who take on student debt in the first place. Wealthy people don't have student debt because they don't need to. So I'm starting to ramble a bit. I'll turn things over to Dr. Bishop, but the ways that student debt really impacts the folks that the system is thought to serve the most and to be designed for is a major problem, and I'm happy that there's more attention being paid to this.
So I'll jump in. As I mentioned earlier, I lead a national Black student debt study where we have surveyed and interviewed, we have surveyed nearly 1,300 Black borrowers and interviewed 100 of them really throughout the pandemic, throughout the last national election. And we're able to see in real time not only how the burden of student debt was affecting Black people and Black borrowers, but also how they were engaging with larger policy debates about what to do about student debt. So what we found in that study and what we heard from Black borrowers is that while they were invested and understood the promise of going to get a higher education, they were very clear that they had deep regrets and were experiencing real burdens by their student loan debt. And this was from borrowers who had a debt in no degree to borrowers who were making six figures, but still reporting that they're not able to contribute to retirement, not able to have a savings, not able to think about kind of what we see as life planning activities in this country because of the student loan debt that often exceeded what they were making in their income. So a big part of what I like to always remind people is that the student debt crisis has become a common term used in the last few years, but for Black people, from the moment they had entered higher education and student loans became the main way we were going to fund the system, there was already a predictable crisis for a Black community that historically, particularly when loans were created in the 1960s and 1970s, a community that historically and currently is excluded from not only wealth building activities, but also from getting well-paying jobs, from being able to have an economic foundation, be able to attend higher education institutions where they have equal resources, have the support they need to persist and graduate. And then a labor market that we know is rampant with discrimination and underemployment and underpaying Black borrowers. So a lot of this crisis when it comes to, I think, racial justice for Black and brown borrowers was predictable in the sense that you're asking the people in the communities that have the least, and they have the least because of structural extraction and exclusion from having what they need, to pay the most when they have to borrow a loan to take on and attend a higher ed system, to navigate a labor market that discriminates and doesn't give them the same return as their white counterparts. So it's always important to point out that this was a policy choice to fund higher education through student loans. And it's more important to point out that the crisis, while it may be emerging for everyone now, that has been something that has kind of piled on for Black and brown communities, I would argue, since we made that choice to fund higher ed with student loans.
Thank you for that, Cody. Mike?
Yeah, I think Dr. Bishop and Abby are spot on when they, connect the burden of student debt for Black and brown borrowers to, historic and systemic issues. The other element that I do want to add is also, how this moment in time right now, the history being written today, impacts Black and brown student loan borrowers. And, it's been unfortunate that as Black student loan borrowers have faced an extra burden of student debt, they've also been shouldering the brunt of the economic and health impacts caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. And so we are seeing, intersectional collision between what's happening more broadly in society when it comes to our physical health and our financial health with this student debt burden. And I'll just add, we at Student Debt Crisis Center recently completed a survey of over 33,000 student loan borrowers. And our findings said the same thing. We saw that Black and brown student loan borrowers had missed rent or missed an auto loan payment or couldn't afford medication at higher rates due to the pandemic, while at the same time had more difficulty finding information about the policy changes and accessing relief that exists currently during the pandemic. So, the racial inequity piece of student debt, it's certainly historic. It goes back generations. And there's also an element of it that is uniquely tied to today's moment. And I don't want to forget that, because this historic pandemic has been a catalyst for so much change in so many areas.
And I'm happy to just let that stand. I think my colleagues did an amazing job teeing that up, and I don't need to layer on top of it.
They really did do an amazing job, and almost perfectly segued me to my next question. The pandemic. So we're still in the midst of it, right? We're trying to get to the other side. We know that there were some COVID payment reliefs for borrowers with federal loans. What's going on with that now? What's going to happen next year? Cody, I think you know the answer to this.
Yeah, I'm happy to just get us started. Mike alluded to it. Right now, federal student loan payments are on pause. They have been on pause since March of last year. But payments are going to resume, or they're set to resume on February 1st. And we're looking at that as a financial cliff, where we are going to see tens of millions of student loan borrowers be pushed back into repayment. It's not just me who's concerned. We heard from the chief operating officer at Federal Financial Aid, Richard Cordray, and he said this is an unprecedented situation in all of consumer finance. So we're deeply concerned about how millions of people are going to re-enter student loan payments. We're concerned about how the system can take this shock. How are millions of people going to be put back in the right repayment plans, have their auto payments be put back in place? It's going to be a logistic nightmare. And unfortunately, it's going to be student loan borrowers and their families that pay the price. On top of that, beyond just the bureaucratic and logistical challenges, is the reality that the pandemic is still happening. We still have millions of Americans who are out of work, have lost hours, or just frankly, haven't gotten fully back on their feet, even if they're back to work. So, part of that survey we just conducted, we found that student loan borrowers are actually employed at high rates. Over 68% of borrowers are fully employed right now. And yet 9 out of 10 say they're not financially secure enough to resume payments on February 1st. So the economic challenges for student loan borrowers are longer lasting and deeper rooted than I think many are willing to acknowledge. And the idea that they'll be pushed back into payments on February 1st just doesn't line up with the economic reality for many of these people.
Cody, the butterflies and sunshine from earlier today seem to have gone away when we get to talking about repayment. Anyone else have anything here?
Real quick on that, Kristen, that is true. But back to my optimism, student loan borrowers by the tens of thousands are taking action, sending letters to lawmakers, sending letters to the White House, and really urging them to extend the pause on payments or just permanently cancel debt so we're not in the same place. So there's a silver lining, and it's that everyday Americans are taking action.
That's right. Anyone have anything else to contribute?
I'm gonna add one more happy note, since I feel like I've been kind of doom and gloom this whole time. It also, the pause in student loan payments shows that the government can do big things to help student loan borrowers. Like, this was unimaginable. I've been doing this for a long time because I'm old. This is unimaginable 10 years ago. The idea that an economic and public health crisis of this magnitude could hit the country, and one of the first things that the government does is protect student loan borrowers. That's amazing. It is directly the product of the incredible organizing that student loan borrowers have been doing for the past decade. And it's rough that this is going to come to an end, but the fact that we're here at all is an enormous achievement. And it's because lawmakers, including Donald Trump, listen to student loan borrowers.
And no one
I
asked
was,
me, but I would say also it proved that cancellation can happen and our country will
Mhm.
collapse because we've done that. And sorry, Dr. Bishop, did I cut you off?
No, that was a great point that we should all be very aware that cancellation can happen, that even in this pause, every month, nearly $10 billion worth of interest has been canceled on these student loans. So we are seeing some type of cancellation happening, that there's some evidence that cancellation can happen at a bigger level. But I think that there's also a moment here. I want to just, pinpoint Mike's point that we couldn't have been in this moment 10 years ago, because we saw a recession happen. We saw this narrative of, there were certain companies or institutions that were too big to fail. And that often didn't include the general population, your everyday person, and definitely not student loan borrowers. A book that recently came out, The Debt Trap, makes a argument that really the first bailout we saw in the last recession was to save the student loan industry and bail them out of some of their kind of predatory practices that put them in a bad place when the recession came. So for us to go from kind of a bailout for Sallie Mae and other service loan providers to having student borrowers themselves be at the forefront of kind of resources and support, I think again shows that the movement is growing and getting stronger. But we also are in a moment where the Department of Ed and the government across the political aisle, from Republicans to Democrats, are making it clear that there's a deeper reason that student loans are so protected, when everyone's acknowledging that we are on our way to a cliff where we don't have the logistics, we don't have the economic evidence, we don't have any indicators that this is going to go well when we turn student loans back on, but they're still going to be turned back on. And I think that is something that we should note, because there's a repeated pattern that if there's going to be risk, if there's going to be harm, if there's going to be a cost that is going to happen because of a mismanagement of student loans, it almost always falls on the borrowers, even though they are not the ones who create the systemic problem.
Yeah, that's real. We're going to transition a little bit from cancellation over to forgiveness. I want to talk about the public service loan forgiveness program. We've seen it all over the news. Can we talk a little bit about what's going on with that program? What are some of the new updates? What do borrowers need to know to be able to access this? Okay, go ahead.
Oh no, I was gonna go first, but if others want to go in, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, Kristen.
No, that was it. I wanted someone to jump in. You got it.
All right. So, and I actually think, building off of Dr. Bishop's point about how the system was allowed to repeatedly fail student loan borrowers, is a pretty great transition into this conversation. One of the most visible failures of the student loan system over the past 10 years is the broken promise to teachers and nurses and other public service workers who had been promised debt relief in a law that was signed by President Bush back in 2007. And failed 99 out of every 100 public service workers who applied. Congress tried to make it better by picking around the edges, and we moved from 99 out of every 100 to 97 or 98 out of every 100 people who applied being denied. And the president moves into this space and takes over responsibility for the student loan system, knowing that these little incremental changes aren't going to fix this program. And there's a lesson there for the whole student loan system. But I think we did get some happy news back in October that rather than kind of once again taking a very piecemeal and technical approach to try to pick around the edges, a bunch of the administrative requirements that had made public service loan forgiveness seize up and fail were swept away. And borrowers are getting credit for the amount of time they spend in repayment while working in public service, exactly as the law intended. Doesn't matter what kind of loan you have, as long as it's a federal loan. It doesn't matter when you took that loan out. It doesn't matter whether you consolidated your loan in the middle. It doesn't matter if you were in the right payment plan. As long as you're making payments and you are working in public service, you're going to get your debt canceled. And we found out just last week that tens of thousands of people have already had their debts canceled, with tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, potentially millions to follow. This is a temporary opportunity to start here. So the administration said that between now and the end of October 2022, you can take some steps to get this special treatment here and to be able to get your debts canceled, even if you didn't follow the exact rules of the program as were put in place a decade ago, which basically no one did. Part of the reason that no one was able to follow the rules is because the student loan companies that the government hired to run the program were lying to their customers about what the rules are. And so This isn't just recognition that public service loan forgiveness was like a bureaucratic failure or too complicated or too much red tape. It's a recognition that a real miscarriage of justice happened here. And it's the same kind of miscarriage of justice that's happened for so many other student loan borrowers that have struggled to get their debts canceled through all of these other purported safety valves in the student loan system. So it's a great opportunity for people. Everyone that works in public service should find out how to take these steps to get their debts canceled, because this is a really broad opportunity for public service workers. More information on our website about how to do this is available at protectborrowers.org/PSLF. It's protectborrowers.org/PSLF. But we're working in coalition with all of the folks on this call and NextGen to make sure that everybody who has these rights is able to access them, along with the largest international labor unions in the world, particularly American Federation of Teachers and the National Education Association, who've been absolutely instrumental in elevating the voices of working people in this fight for debt cancellation, not just on public service loan forgiveness, but debt cancellation for everybody. So we have a long road ahead. This is just a start, but it is going to be life-changing for the people that benefit.
Yeah, if I could just add one element to the public service workers that I think is also really important here. Mike's right. These are people that have, tried to do the right thing and yet have been, really taken advantage of by a broken system. But one thing I think is really important to clarify for folks that are listening, these student loan borrowers aren't just people who are saying, hey, I expected this benefit and I'm not getting it, and where's mine? I've spoken so much to student loan borrowers who've told me they've made personal sacrifices. They've planned their futures based on the expectation that this system would work for them. I hear from a social worker who tells me, I couldn't have done this work if I knew that I was going to have to continue making student loan payments. So these are, the everyday heroes that we talk about, the everyday heroes that we all were applauding at the beginning of the pandemic, like nurses and firefighters and first responders and other folks and teachers who were going back to the classroom. And they've made personal sacrifices, and the government promised a return to them of relief from their student loan debt. And we have to follow through as a society. These people are too critical, too important to our lives to let this promise go unfulfilled.
Thank you. So we know that servicers are starting to call us and email us so that we can transition back into repayment. Where can borrowers get trusted information about repayment options to make sure that we're communicating with the correct people and that the correct people are calling us? Abby.
Yeah, that's a great question. So in terms of getting information about repayment options, the Department of Education has, I think, done a pretty good job in recent years of improving their own website. Obviously, as many of the folks here know, the student loan repayment system is unnecessarily complex and very hard to navigate. But the department does have information on its website about what the different repayment options are. You can, if you have your FSA ID, you can log in to get sort of estimates of what your payments would be under the different repayment plans that you're eligible for, how long you would pay. The estimates aren't perfect, but I do think they are helpful. And yes, thanks, Cody. Studentaid.gov. NCLC's Student Loan Borrower Assistance Project also has information for borrowers on our website, studentloanborrowerassistance.org. And Mike might be able to answer if the CFPB still has its information on its website. The CFPB used to be provide sort of good alternative information to the department when the department's information was less useful. Additionally, borrowers should be able to get information from their servicers, either through their online portals or by calling servicers. And the problems we've seen include that often servicers aren't the call center employees aren't adequately trained, supported, et cetera, to give borrowers accurate information. And so I would always encourage borrowers to check, double check, and triple check, and not just rely on what they're told on the phone.
Mike looks
And echoing Abby, I think the CFPB's website is good. There's a lot there, but in particular, it's where you can go if you have a complaint about what you've been told by your student loan company. If something doesn't feel right, it's probably not right, and you should ask the government for help and expect that they'll deliver for you. And I just dropped a link in the chat, but consumerfinance.gov/complaint is where you can go submit a complaint about your student loan company.
And I'll just add really quickly, and I think Abby made this point really well, is that even when you have the official information, even when you have read all the fine print, you may be dealing with a loan servicer or some type of process that is not following the kind of official public guidelines. And that's a common thing. So in my experience, helping borrowers, helping members of my family navigate the student loan system, is always helpful to find, if you can, online communities that can give you some of that insider information of how to successfully navigate some of these programs, or how to file a complaint when you are coming into a barrier of inaccurate information. So I shared a link to the Debt Collective that runs kind of an online forum of borrowers. I always encourage people, particularly for unique programs like the Public Service Loan Forgiveness, to look for online Facebook groups, because all of these different groups are sharing. People are actively going through the same experience as you may be going through, and they have some inside knowledge of what to do when the loan servicer provide the borrower with loan information, and how to respond, who to file your complaint with, and so on.
Okay, I have one last question that is very wonky. And we have talked about a lot of things today: public service loan forgiveness, debt cancellation, repayment. I know that our Department of Education is going through the rulemaking process. YI actually has 2 alternate negotiators participating. Does anyone want to give us a Cliff's Notes version? I might have dated myself with Cliff's Notes. Cliff's Notes version of what the rulemaking process is and what kind of changes could come into effect due to that.
I'm happy to kick that off, and then others should please jump in and fill in blanks. But the negotiated rulemaking process is the process that the department uses to come up with new rules around the student loan system. And it means that they call together sort of stakeholders or representatives from different communities that are impacted by student loans, including borrowers, legal aid. That's my colleague Persis Yu has been representing legal aids, schools, servicers, et cetera, to sort of sit around a virtual table and give their input for what the changes to rules should look like, what new rules should be made. And then the department releases written proposed rules. There's an opportunity for public comment, and then eventually final rules. The current negotiated rulemaking that is going on is unusually wide-ranging. The department is trying to use this opportunity to change lots of the rules in the student loan system, which is good, because I think it acknowledges that lots of the parts of the system are broken and need fixing. Some of the things that we are most interested in that could come out of this current rulemaking are the potential for creation of a new, hopefully improved income-driven repayment program that is more affordable and more accessible to borrowers who need it. Improvements to the, as we've heard, broken public service loan forgiveness program. Better rules for how and when borrowers can get their loans canceled based on their school's lies, predatory recruitment, or based on or closure, or based on a borrower's disability. Reducing the triggers for when outstanding student loan interest capitalizes, so it gets sort of tacked onto your principal and you start paying interest on interest. So this has been one of the big reasons that borrowers, particularly in income-driven repayment or using forbearances, see their balances go up and up and up over time, and even while they're making payments. And limits on school abuse of arbitration clauses that silence complaints about the school and bar borrowers from accessing the courts to vindicate their rights. So those are some of the big topics that we are looking at in this rulemaking. And In terms of timeline, nothing happens that quickly when we're talking regulations, but most likely we would see proposed rules sometime this summer and final rules maybe ideally by November 1st, so that they could then go into effect in summer of 2023.
Thank you. I feel like you summed it up very nicely. So we can transition to question and answer. So if you have questions, you can use the chat feature, you can use the Q&A box. I see one really quickly. We have a parent who is carrying a large student loan debt, who is 75 years old and retired with health issues. And they are saying due to medical expenses, they will never be able to pay off this loan. What do they do?
Well, there's a few options out there. So first and foremost, let me start with this. If you have a federal student loan, there are options available no matter what type of loan you have. They're not always the perfect solution, but there's some choice out there to make your situation more manageable. My first advice for someone like this is to explore their affordable repayment programs. We call them income-driven repayment plans. This could set your monthly payment as low as $0 per month based on what your income is. And if you're retired, you likely have, a lower fixed income. That can be a solution to help folks manage their monthly payments. It's not necessarily going to be a track to pay back your debt, but I talk to borrowers every day that just need to manage their monthly payments so they have enough to survive, to put roof over their head and food on the table. So that's my first bit of advice. Anyone that reaches out to me that has a particular health challenge as well, I do want folks to know there are real loan forgiveness and discharge options that exist out there. And one of them is for people who are totally and permanently disabled. And I do know people who have been able to have their loans completely erased because they just can no longer work. So that is an option. It's not for everyone, obviously, and it's a small chunk of borrowers who can receive that type of relief. But there are these other programs designed for people with unique personal challenges. To Abby's point, though, they're all complicated. The only way to take advantage of these programs is to know your options. And so I would, go to studentaid.gov, direct to the source at the Department of Ed, or as Dr. Bishop mentioned, reach out to one of the organizations that are in your trusted communities and try to get as much information as you can so you know what options are best for you.
This next one is not a question, but it is a comment that needs to be read aloud from Mary. It would be helpful if the hold on payments was extended while the entire system and the situation is reviewed and revised. Why go back to a broken and predatory system? Yeah, Mary, the answer to that is, I don't know. I think you're just correct. Thank you for that. And then we have one here. I saw a clip of a documentary that student debt cancellation would hurt the economy. How is that possible? Anybody want to jump in there?
Nobody else wants it. I'll do it with a smile on my face. It's not possible. So one of the things that people seem to pivot back to when trying to talk lawmakers or policymakers out of canceling student debt is this idea that canceling student debt needs to be paid for, that Congress needs to come up with the money so that our fiscal house is in order or whatever. And I in case you can't tell from my tone of my response here, these are just excuses that are made by people that want to create impediments to our progress here. The good news is that back in 1965, Congress gave the Secretary of Education all the legal authority that he needs to cancel student debt for everybody. And it doesn't need to be paid for. It got paid for when these loans were made to people. And every year, the federal government makes loans that have this clause in the law that allows the Secretary of Education to cancel them. Every year, when another $100 billion of the loans get made to student loan borrowers, the possibility of cancellation is baked into those loans. So people say that. Certainly, it's a concern that people that want to oppose progress raise, but there's no truth to it. There's no substance to it.
I see in the comments here that we are talking about servicers are transferring loans to other companies. How will this impact current borrowers?
Oh, go ahead, Abby, please.
So we are concerned that in the past, when borrowers' accounts have been transferred between servicers, that mistakes have been made in the transferring, that incomplete and incorrect information has gone from one servicer to another. That can be very hard to unwind, or for borrowers to ever find out about, or to find out about in a timely manner, given how little information the servicers provide to borrowers about their accounts and their payment history. So that's one of the problems. Another problem is just, borrower confusion. So there's all these scammy student debt relief companies out there spamming borrowers all the time. And so if you get a contact from some new servicer, borrowers might well ignore it, very reasonably ignore it. And so that's another problem. We're also concerned that borrowers won't know sort of how and who to make their payments to. Additionally, there's just like the capacity of these servicers that are suddenly taking on a bunch of new accounts. We're having tens of millions of student borrower accounts transferred from one servicer to another. So if a servicer is absorbing all these new, maybe has twice as many accounts to service, are they going to have the appropriate staffing, training, capacities to handle all that, even in normal times, much less in this sort of return to repayment context, where borrowers are going to have lots of questions, need to make lots of changes to their IDR programs, et cetera. So those are a few things we're concerned about.
And I'll just add really quickly, an interview that sticks with me from my national study was someone talking about their loan servicer and said that the Department of Ed presents loan servicing companies as if they're financial advisors or financial planners, but they operate more like used car salesmen. And I think that quote sticks with me because often when I'm working with borrowers or going through my own experience, that you get so much inaccurate information, such a runaround, that I think it's important for borrowers not to take this experience as that individually they're failing somehow, that they are uniquely having challenges, that this really is a systemic issue. And I try to sum up Cody's points around how to navigate something that across the board everyone is documenting as chaotic, is to really try to get into income-based repayment plans and get your payments to something that's manageable, which may be $0 a month, but really to make sure you're taking that first step. I like to just emphasize that again, because you are being kind of thrown into a chaotic system. And at the end of the day, that's the reality. Even our best advice still may not hold up because we're dealing with a system that really is not designed to be successful. So try to manage that reality by getting that payment to something that's manageable, even if that's $0.
Yeah, and the last point I'll add, if you haven't connected the dots already, is, we're talking about 16 million Americans are going to have their student loan servicers change in the near future. That alone was going to be a huge task. We also have tens of millions of Americans who need to be put back into student loan payments in the next few months. That itself was going to be a huge task. And now we have, 500,000+ borrowers that need to get enrolled over the next year to access student loan forgiveness through the public service loan forgiveness program. That would be a huge task as well. So there's a lot happening all at the same time right now. Each one of them would have been a challenge in its own right. So there is going to be a lot of work to be done to make sure that each one of these components works in a way that benefits borrowers.
Thank you. So I do see that there is a question about permanent and total disability. So if we can drop the link where they can go find the definitions for those. And before we wrap up, I want to take this last 5 minutes for you all to leave any lingering thoughts. Oh, when do you sign up for PSLF? That's a good question. So if we can wrap up and your final thoughts, things that the world needs to know about student debt, advocacy, how to get involved, how to pay your loans. I know for me, that was my biggest issue. I actually didn't know how to repay my loans and ended up defaulting when I graduated, because every time I called, they put me in deferment or forbearance and then told me I was out of them. So I actually didn't know how And that is how my debt actually doubled, is from being defaulted. So I think these are important things that we have to explain to folks. You know, the exit interview is not enough. We need to make sure people know how to repay. So final thoughts. We will start with Abby and move ourselves around.
Yeah, well, I'm so glad, Kristen, that you brought up your experience with default, because that's one of the biggest problems I see with the current student loan system, is how punishing it is to borrowers who default. And we know that borrowers go into default not because they don't want to make payments or because there's something wrong with them. They default because the system is broken. They default because of bad servicing. They default because they don't have family wealth to fall back upon when their car breaks down, et cetera. But and that 90% of the borrowers who default are Pell Grant recipients who are coming from lower income or lower wealth families, or and that 50% of borrowers who of Black borrowers experience default at some time and just get pummeled. You know, you can get your tax refunds, including child tax credit and earned income tax credit seized, Social Security seized, wages seized. So borrowers pay, you know, much more as a result of default. And this is one of the biggest problems with the system that we would like to see changed, and that we are working to change now.
Final thoughts. When I think about just what's happening with the movement around student debt, it does give me hope. So I always tell borrowers or advocates or people who just care about what's happening with student loans to understand how this is a bigger trend that we're seeing throughout the country, that increasingly the things that we need in order to live full livelihoods are being shifted to arenas and industries, and shifted in ways that requires us to increasingly take on debt to access those things, so that we are often having to turn to debt for medical needs, for housing needs, and so on, and education fits into that larger trend. And my final thought to people is that while we all are experiencing kind of this increased debthood that we're navigating in society, that also is kind of a collective power for us to think about how we can collectively come together, continue to do movement building, to join organizations that we have dropped links to, such as the Debt Collective and some of the organizations represented by the panelists, where you can bring your experience, bring your burden collectively together, and continue to advocate and push not only for student debt to be canceled, but also for higher ed to be treated as a public good, not something that we have to spend our lifetime kind of repaying. So just again, thinking about how your individual experience also becomes an opening for you to contribute and be a part of a collective power or movement.
Dr. Bishop's comment is a great segue for my final comments here. At Student Debt Crisis Center, we believe full-heartedly that we need to end the student debt crisis, but at the same time, we need to empower individuals impacted by the crisis so that they can better manage their situation. And so I'm honored to be on this call, because everyone on today's call not only advocates for student loan borrowers, but has some level of component of their work that is designed to spread outreach and awareness of repayment programs and educate the public as far as what their rights are. So I would just tell the audience today, you know, the best way that you can take action is to first take control of your student debt situation, and then use that freedom to create change. And so you can reach out to any of these organizations. You can contact Student Debt Crisis Center, and we will provide resources to help you lift that burden of student debt and make you more equipped and more able to fight for change.
I don't know how I got lucky enough to be able to close this out here, but all of those comments were awesome, and I couldn't possibly agree more. And I think I would love to just be able to echo what Dr. Bishop said about collective action, and say, if you're a member of a labor union, your union is fighting for you. We would not be where we are, fighting for debt cancellation, fighting for big structural changes to the student loan system, if it wasn't for our friends in organized labor, and really not just the public service union, the public sector unions, but in particular, I think National Education Association, American Federation of Teachers have been fighting in the halls of power in Washington, using the access that they have on behalf of their millions of members to help lift up the voices for everybody with student debt. And if you run into trouble, your local might be able to help you too. So there's lots of direct action you can take, resources you can get through your union if you are fortunate enough to work in a unionized workplace. And if not, organize. I think there's lots of ways to be able to help drive change through collective action, both through organizations like the Debt Collective and through Student Debt Crisis that have millions of members, but also through labor.
Thank you all so much for joining us today. This is the first day of the Free My Future Summit. For all of the California policymakers, legislative staff, and agency who are tuning in, please stay on for our next event, a legislative briefing and workshop for what California staff needs to know about student loan debt. Get help on your loans, especially on public service loan forgiveness. This event will be starting at 12 p.m., which is in about 2 minutes. To the panelists, again, thank you for all of your time. I think I can speak for everyone that we've learned a lot today. We've answered a lot of questions in the chat, and I'll just take a moment of privilege to say that this is what we need to be able to get to the other side of this debt crisis that we're in, is this collective information sharing. So people in the audience, anytime there's an opportunity for advocacy or sharing your story, please do so that we can really put faces to what's happening here in America. So thank you so much. Next panel starts in a minute, and I will see you all soon. Signing out.